Okay. Okay. Yeah. Whoa. Okay. I was wondering why you were all ignoring me. I'm not going to take it personally. It's because you couldn't hear me, but now you can hear me. So it's wonderful to see you all. This is like such a special, incredible place because you have overflow sessions for, I just came from this really fascinating conversation on public financing. Couldn't get in the door. That's the beauty of this event. There's so much excitement, and I'm glad to see that you're excited to talk about risk assessments. So I'm Joel Simon. I'm the founding director of the Journalism Protection Initiative at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY, which is the City University of New York. And I know that's a mouthful, but that's got to get that all in there. So we're here today to talk about risk assessments. We're not going to talk about how to do them. Not going to talk about how to do them. I'm going to tell you how you can learn how to do them. There are going to be a number of great opportunities. There are safety clinics being offered. You'll hear more about that. But what we're going to talk about today is why they should be done. And the premise of this panel is that risk assessments can actually be a universal safety tool that can be applied and adapted to really every environment in which journalists work, and whether that means whether covering an international conflict with the backing and support of a major news organization, or writing about culture and the arts for your own Substack. And yes, there are risks associated with that. So if our hope is that we can manage to convince journalists and news organizations that this is a really important tool and a good practice, and if that happens, then there's some concrete things you can do. And I mentioned these the safety workshops that are being offered here. Maria Salazar-Ferro, who I'll introduce in a moment, is very much involved in that, and she'll be telling you about those opportunities. Many of them are offered via ACOS, which stands for a Culture of Safety, which has become a leading organization working in this space, has organized those clinics, and I hope you can attend. But let me introduce the panelists. So this is, as I mentioned, this is Maria Salazar-Ferro. Maria heads up Newsroom Safety and Resilience at the New York Times, and we also have with us Carlos Dara. He's the editor-in-chief of El Faro, which is a renowned digital news organization. It's based in El Salvador, but it really covers the entire region of Central America. We were hoping very much so to be joined today by Amy Wilczowski. She's the chief operating officer at the New Humanitarian, and the New Humanitarian is a nonprofit news organization based in Geneva that covers conflict around the world. Really an amazing organization that you should all know about. Unfortunately, Amy could not be with us for personal reasons. We'll really miss having her perspective. So let's start with you, Maria. Let's get going here. And so Maria, you and I worked together for many years at the Committee to Protect Journalists. And we, when we deployed staff and did, a kind of missions, we used to call them, around the world, we used to do risk assessments. And I got to admit, I wasn't a big fan of them. They were like paperwork, and you had to fill these things out, and they were like onerous, and people, I mean, they were useful, they had a purpose, but people really found them to be a pain in the neck and a bit of bureaucracy that they didn't enjoy. And then, so you at the New York Times, you're at the New York Times now, and you do a safety training course called Art School, and I attended, and I was really fascinated how central risk assessments are to the training that you offer to people at the New York Times. And I wonder if you could tell people a little bit about what is Art School, what is this training, and what role do risk assessments play in that training, and how have you sort of reconceptualized what risk assessments are?
So I literally have reconceptualized those from my time at CPJ. I'm smiling because I was the enforcer of the paperwork, and no one ever wanted to do it.
But no one ever wanted to mess with you. You were a pretty good enforcer, I gotta say.
Thank you. So we've come a ways from there. Art School, thank you. I double mic'd. Art School stands for Adversarial Reporter Training. It's a cheeky name we gave to this workshop. That was actually started by my boss, Jason Reich, who's the vice president of safety and security at the New York Times. But he started it way back when he was working at BuzzFeed. I think this was 15 years ago. It was started in a hotel room. And the idea there is it's not a proper HEFAT, hostile environment first aid training, which is what a lot of us in the news industry are used to. Art school is intended for anyone. It is not only intended for folks who are going to be covering a war or a conflict. The idea is that every reporter is going to be facing some adversarial risk. They're going to be facing an adversary, and they need to be thinking about risk, about how to mitigate risk, and about how to engage in risk. So that's essentially what art school is doing. We teach all our journalists how to think about risk and how to engage with risk. And in this environment, which is actually, it's quite fun, if I may say so, what we do is we look at different risk scenarios and are always assessing those. So we look at risk in a physical environment, we look at risk in an environmental environment, and that's when we're thinking about low resource reporting, natural disasters, that sort of thing. And we think about investigations in digital risk. And I'm going to have to talk about my stool, Joel.
Oh, you talk about the stool, yeah. You're known for that stool.
This is the tattoo I'm getting. Essentially, the way we think about safety beyond those environments is that safety is a stool. Safety for all our journalists is a stool. It's a three-legged stool. So in order for you to do your reporting, we want you to be able to be sitting and be comfortable sitting and be able to focus on the reporting and not think about whether you're wiggling or whether you're going to fall. So this stool has 3 legs. It has the very classic physical safety leg. So that's, are you going to be wearing PPE? What kind of helmet do you need to be wearing? What kind of gas mask do you need to be wearing? Are you going to be meeting a source at a shady bar? How are you going to think about that? Then there's the online risk, because as journalists, you're all operating not only in a physical environment, you're operating online. So how are you communicating? What information are you putting out there about yourself? So we're thinking about that. And then the third leg is the psychological leg, because again, as journalists, no matter where you are, you're operating in a psychological environment as you're preparing a story, as you're covering a story, or when you're coming back from that story. There's going to be ways that it's going to be affecting you, and that you need to be thinking about the same thing. What PPE are you going to be wearing for that particular story? And all of them need to be thought about at the same time, because every story is going to have a little bit of a component of each. So that's the way we approach it at art school. We're always thinking about how all these things intersect for a particular story, a particular reporting team at a particular time. And that's where risk assessment comes in, because you're thinking about all these at once. And that was my long answer for art school.
But I mean, I think what's so interesting about it is the way in which you kind of repurposed and reconceptualized a risk assessment as a conversation, and something that's really organic and natural, built into the assigning process, and something that takes place between an editor and a reporter, and it could lead to a more rigorous process. And sometimes it's inevitable. You have to go through that exercise of doing those rigorous forms, but that's not necessarily the entry point. The entry point is really about having a dialogue and a conversation about the potential risks, and a very common sense kind of conversation.
Right, and that's why art school and all these workshops are offered to everyone, to sort of go back to a culture of safety or ACOS Alliance. The idea here is to build a culture in which safety and conversations about safety are just part of the news gathering process. So every time someone is going to pitch a story, they're going to think about the same way journalists are thinking about how they're going to find a source or whatever. They're thinking about risk, and that conversation is happening with the editor. And when they find a different threshold, or they find that there's a part that they need to bring in someone additional, they bring the safety team in, and we'll have a conversation again. We'll sit with a reporter for the reporting team, because it's always important that everyone understand their appetite for risk and that everyone understand what mitigations to take. So we'll sit on a Google Meet or in person, and we will talk about who's going, what are you going to be reporting on, what do you need to take, and if this happens, what are we going to do? And that's the end of it. It's not
Well,
paperwork we used to do.
it's great because it demystifies and also like humanizes this whole process. But let's bring in Carlos now. Look, Alfaro is an incredible publication, but you're not the New York Times. I mean, you don't have like a safety team, you don't have like the resources to do all this training, but you're working in a very risky environment. I mean, you face legal risks, you face physical threats, you face emotional challenges. Maria's talked about that. And I remember when I wrote about this, I wrote an article about how risk assessments could be an important tool. You like called me up and you're like, this is what we do. This is like the main thing that we do to keep our people safe. So maybe you could talk about that. How does it work?
Gracias, Joel. It's not that different than what Maria said, actually. I think we just arrived at a common point from very different starting points. As you said, we're not the New York Times. We are a very small newsroom and that have been dealing for many years with security problems on the field, reporting about gangs, reporting about drug trafficking, reporting about corruption, war crimes, etc. So many years ago, I started looking for guidance. How do we assess this? How do we protect ourselves? And most of the things that I found, because everything comes out of developed countries, were manuals made specifically for Western journalists going to a hotspot and then evacuating them, which were useless, completely useless for us. So we had to develop a way to protect ourselves. And we came up first with 7 points, which are basically the three-legged stool plus legal defense, and what I call one of our biggest protections, which is accuracy in reporting. Do not accuse or insult anyone if you can't prove it. Don't make it personal. And also what we called, for lack of a better word, international protection, which meant building a network in case that we needed some support, to have international support or people calling for our protection, so the price for harming us would be much higher for those who are trying to harm us. I think we came up late to find out that it has psychological effects on us. I think it was the last part that we really addressed, and I don't think we're very good at that yet. But it's a very serious thing. But let me start by the physical protections that we started doing. We started a process of monitoring, and we created what we call an emergency committee, which means in moments of really, really big stress or big risk, what we found out is that when you are under big risk or threats or something, your perception of that risk is almost never equal to the real risk. It's usually higher or lower, depending on how you're feeling that day, because it can be the same person one day feeling there's not such a risk, and the other day being very paranoid. But that's very natural, that's very human. It's very hard to go against it. So we settled an emergency committee, which allows anyone to go crazy, but it doesn't allow the newspaper to go crazy, right? So the committee makes the decisions. And sometimes, especially when there's a life at risk, the reporter or the person at risk needs to trust that the decisions made in the committee are the best decisions for his own safety. And he needs to follow, or she needs to follow that advice, even against his own instincts. It's very hard to achieve that, but once everybody is convinced, it's very useful. We found it was the better way, the better solution we could come with to solve the problem of perception. And then when anyone goes to the field, we have 1 or 2 persons, depending on the situation, all the time monitoring that person. And that person needs to go by what Maria said. We assess the risk in a conversation. Before I go on, let me tell you something. Nothing of what we've talked about works. Nothing works if there is not trust between editors and reporters. And if you're a reporter and don't trust your editor, don't go to any risky place. And if you're an editor and you don't trust your reporter, or you don't know how to assess his own security, don't let him go. It doesn't work. You need to build trust, and that requires time, of course. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, that's amazing and such an important point. So I wonder if we could do something now. Could each of you take us through a real-life example, assignment, and you can start, Carlos said Alfaro, where you did this process, you had a conversation, you identified some risk, and took some steps, mitigation, to reduce the risk. Can you take us through an example? Me? Yes, you. And then Maria.
Okay. This was, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. A reporter, Carlos Martinez, and a photographer, Victor Peña, were in southern Mexico. They were following the story of a migrant Salvadoran woman with her son that was migrating to the United States because she had been threatened by gangs in El Salvador. So they met her in a small town called Comalapa de la Frontera in Chiapas. And when they arrived there, they stayed at the only hotel downtown, and then the night they had arrived, someone knocked at the door of one of them and said, "Look, you have a phone call." And the guy on the phone told him, "Listen, I am the commander of this region, and you need to tell me who you are, give me your passport number and your phone number." And he said, "Well, why don't you come in and show you my passport?" And then he said, "You don't understand anything. I am telling you I'm the CETAS commander of the region, and you're going to do as I tell you. Give me your phone number of your cell phone, and you're going to follow exactly everything that I'm telling you." And this guy decided to give him a wrong phone number, and he rushed to his room and told the photographer, "We need to leave now." So they stepped into the car. They were chased for a while, and they immediately called us and said, "What do we do?" Right? And we said, "Where are you? Where are you heading towards?" The highway, we knew where they were. And we started arranging their way out. We said, "Turn off one of the phones so you have enough battery in case the other one turns, the juice goes off, and just follow our instructions." And we guided them all the way out. So when they arrived to Tuxtla Gutierrez, they already had a place to sleep. There was someone waiting for them. It turned out not to be the case when they learned who they were, that they were reporters being chased by CETAS. They took back their kind offer to host them, so we needed to keep guiding them. But the amazing thing about this is that these guys were being chased by a criminal organization, and they still trusted us to guide them. So we made the decisions. There were 3 of us making the decisions for them. It was their life at stake, and they followed every single step. Why? Because they knew it was their life at risk, and we were more able to make the right decisions on their behalf, so it worked.
Yeah, that's an incredible story, and knowing the individuals involved, they're incredible journalists. It would be helpful, Maria, if you could give an example, because that was a really high risk, and I think those kinds of risks are familiar to people. But is there some way in which you incorporate this process into more routine assignments that may be more everyday? And if so, how does it work? And can you provide an example?
Yeah, I was sitting here racking my brain with how I was going to follow that story. So actually, this is a good one. It's very simple, and I'm going to focus on physical safety, even though we will run these sort of conversations with folks ahead of a story that might bring a lot of online repercussions as well. But to keep it a little more cheeky, we had a Metro reporter and a freelance journalist, I think it was last year, going to cover, they had been doing a series of stories on sex parties in New York, and they were going to go to one somewhere in Brooklyn, and the reporter, actually it was her editor who reached out from the Metro section and said he felt a little bit uncomfortable sending two younger females, to the sex party on their own. So could we sit and think about how we were going to do the story? So we all, again, jumped on it wasn't live, they were about to go out. We jumped on a conversation online and discussed what the story was. Did everyone feel okay doing it? Everyone felt okay doing it, and what we were gonna do. Ultimately, we decided that for us, the risk level was not that high from sitting from the safety team, but both the editor and the two journalists who were going felt more comfortable if we were able to send someone with them. So someone from my team was able to go accompany them to the party. His wife didn't love the idea of sending him to the sex party.
Sometimes as a reporter, you have to.
And it was okay. But had he not been able to do it, what we would have done, and what was also discussed, was doing a check-in procedure in which they were going to check in with us as they entered the party with information about the party. They were going to do a check-in 2 hours into the party, and they were going to reach out again to us after the party.
Yeah, and that's a great story, and it just shows again. I mean, again, as an exercise, one of the great advantages is something Carlos referred to, which is just building trust and making reporters and editors work through the kinds of challenges that they'll face and build a rapport and a kind of caring relationship, which I think goes a long way. But one of the, in addition to your New York Times role, you're the president of the ACOS Alliance, and since we don't have Amy with us to provide another perspective, just what is your sense of how across the media industry thinking about risk assessments and their role has evolved from your ACOS position?
Yeah, I mean, if I can give just a little tiny backstory into ACOS. ACOS came to live around the same time that actually Joel and I started working on the emergencies department at the Committee to Protect Journalists. I think there was, this was, just to put you in the story, this was, I think it was around 2013, 2014, when a lot of freelancers were being kidnapped and eventually were killed in Syria. So they were international freelancers, and it kind of shook the way that the industry overall thought about it. So the first steps that started to come around was to talk more about freelancer safety and to talk more about what that meant and what role editors were playing and what role freelancers were playing and what role organizations were playing. So that was the first conversation, and that was a sort of a difficult conversation to start having. But just fast forward to now, and it's not only about freelancers, the conversations happening, there's so many more conversations happening about risk to staffers, risk to local journalists, and I think generally, the fact that these conversations are happening is very good, and I have seen, just like Carlos was saying, I've seen so many different ideas of engaging with risk that are being developed in different types of newsrooms, whether it's small, really small newsrooms in the US, or the New York Times, or you're seeing it internationally. You're just seeing a lot more people just talking about it.
Yeah. Well, and again, this after, I think the first one is this afternoon at 2 p.m. There's the safety clinics, and you can sign up, and they're individual sessions, and there's a whole range of people with incredible background and experience and resources. So I don't know if we're able to put up the URL, but I think there's one today and tomorrow and Saturday, right?
That's right, and it's in your little book if you want to look, but we still have some spots for people to sign up. We're going to be looking at it. A lot of the trainers are actually here. We're going to be looking at individual stories, and just to go back to the way that we do it at art school, every story, every reporting team is going to have different risks. So there's no stamp that you can put on it, no one paperwork that you fill out. It's about the conversation and about talking about it, and that's what the clinics are. Your own individual risk, your own individual profile and identity, and how that all plays out, and talking about it with someone who can help you sort of structure that.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to ask Carlos one more thing, and then we'll open it up to questions. And I want to talk a little bit about the way we're thinking about this. First of all, at the Newark School, where we've been having a lot of discussions about how we bring safety into the curriculum at a journalism school where the people who graduate are going to be practicing journalism in an environment in which there's a kind of ambient level of risk. It's just part of the background that we may not have encountered when we were starting our careers, and the risk assessment, in my view, is sort of at the heart of that. And we, have offered as part of our orientation a kind of a clinic on how to do risk assessments, and we're going to be looking for ways to, build on that and structure it into the curriculum. But one of the things I've found, going back to our work together at CPJ and the kind of beginning of this culture of recognition, of kind of preparing journalists to work in a more risky environment, a lot of the response was about, building training and a kind of specialized style of training. We mentioned HEFAT, the hostile environment and first aid training, that is very effective for certain journalists in certain contexts and certain environments, but it's very expensive and it's not scalable, and it really doesn't work for journalists working in an environment in which the kind of risk is constant. And when last summer I spent the last summer visiting newsrooms in India, and I got a lot of questions in these very low resourced environments, like what can we do to reduce risk? And I didn't feel I could say, well, run a big training and bring in a safety team and do all these things that are important but are difficult to do in a low resourced environment. But the thing about risk assessments is they can be they're cost free. They are about changing the culture, and there's this incredible universe of resources that have been created that you can tap into. A lot of them are available for free and online once you are able to identify what the risks are, and you can build best practice. So I wonder, Carlos, before we open it up to questions, if you could talk about, just from your experience, if you are a newsroom like yours, and you want to create your own kind of process built around this strategy, what would you do? What would you recommend?
I don't know, Joe. I think
that's not the right answer.
I think Maria said it correctly. Every situation means a different challenge. Let me tell you one of our new challenges, which I think is very common to what you are facing today. As polarization, political polarization is growing around the world, now journalists in the United States, for example, and here in Europe, and we are now facing new challenges. For example, my country, El Salvador, is now ruled by an authoritarian government presided by Nayib Bukele, who has publicly declared us public enemies. So now we're facing a new challenge that we didn't have before. How do we cover political meetings from this party? We just had elections. Two reporters were in one of the campaign events, and they were already pointed out by government officials on Twitter. El Faro guys are here. We're going to send them food, poor people, which may bring as a consequence violence from parties and people that believe that we are public enemies. This is a new challenge that polarization is bringing to every single newsroom, almost everywhere in the world. So you ask me, how does an organization like mine start a process to engage in risk assessment? I would say that conversation is a key element here. You need to have honest conversations between editors and reporters. And again, you need to build trust. If you're a reporter and don't trust that your editor is really someone you can trust your life with. It's very difficult that you have a dynamic where any kind of risk assessment would work. If you are an editor and you don't trust a reporter that he will or she will follow your instructions when you have any kind of risk assessment, then it's very difficult. I think that when I tell you I don't know what to recommend, is that I am conscious that I come from a very particular organization that has been built as a group, right?
Yeah.
So we have more than 2 decades working together. So trust is natural among us, which is not the case in every single newsroom. So I don't know how to advise new newsrooms or small newsrooms that have not been built in the same way, because our experience, I am conscious, is very peculiar.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would say, just to pick up on that, though, is this is my own experience, is that each news organization has to build its own structures and culture. So you have yours, and I think you've given us a couple key elements. One is trust, that's critical, and the other is communication. That's key to this process. But one, community that's very important that we haven't really addressed, and this is the last answer from you before we open it up, is freelancers. I mean, this assumes, whether you're a small or a large organization, you have some relationship with an editor, but that's not always the case. Sometimes sometimes the example I gave, you're a Substacker, you're doing your journalism on social media. There are so many ways of doing journalism now. How do you access this process? How can you make it work for you?
It goes back to the shared culture and the shared language, and it has to be beyond your own newsroom. It has to be a language that we are sharing as a community. But I will put a plug in for a lot of organizations that are working with freelancers, and a lot of resources that are available. ACOS, which I'm part of, has amazing tools, so please check them out. They're online, but ACOS also routinely runs workshops or works with organizations like the New York Times to bring freelancers to our workshops, again, so that you can sort of develop the same language that you'll be working with editors on. I will also plug in the importance of educating and giving the resources and the same tools to editors, just to sort of piggyback and echo what Carlos was saying. You cannot only be focusing on the reporters and the photographers, you need the editors to have access to the same things so everyone can meet in that place. So same goes for freelancers. If commissioning editors are getting the same language and the same tools, that's going to be really helpful. Other organizations that run really interesting projects are, again, the Committee to Protect Journalists. They have a WhatsApp group where you can ask questions as a freelancer and you will get an answer. The IWMF, the International Women's Media Foundation, runs HEFATs and other courses that are available. So there's a variety of things that freelancers can access. Insurance, through ACOS, or we have information about insurance for freelancers. I think the important thing here is to, again, come to the clinics. We will be able to help you there, but also to look for places where those resources are being shared, and to make sure that both the freelancers and the editors are engaging with those.
Well, that's fantastic. I have a lot more questions, but I promise to open it up. So let's take questions from the audience. And is there a microphone? Do we need a microphone, or can people just yell out? I think there is. Yeah, Katja's hand is up. So can we go to the Katja first, the woman in the, yeah, if you could be first, and then behind you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm Katerina Sergatskova. I'm leading the organization that basically develops safety culture in media and for civic actors in Ukraine. And we've been, we trained about 700 journalists and civic actors in the last 2 years because of the invasion. But most of the people who are coming to this HIPAA training, they are kind of, in one hand, they have motivation. They want to know what to do in the critical situation during the shelling or in some, like during investigation. But most of them do not have any knowledge about, they don't even know what risk assessment is. So that's what we work with. And I think it's really important to understand what can motivate people in our sphere, what can motivate journalists and editors to learn more about safety, because it's kind of a basics that everyone should know in our world currently. So maybe you have some ideas what can motivate them, like not only insurance, because like insurance is something that people need HIFA training to receive the insurance, but maybe something like deeper, so we could do more for us, for the industry. Thank you.
Tell us what worked for both of you in terms of motivating your news organizations to embrace this more fully.
It's a really hard question, Katya.
Well, what would you expect?
Well, yeah, right. I honestly find that there are a couple of entries to the newsroom when they're a little bit reluctant. One is sources and bringing up source safety, because even if journalists are reluctant to, I'm fine, this is not dangerous. If you bring up, but we want to make sure your sources are okay, they'll come. That's one way. Another way that I've often found is motivating, and I don't know if it really works in your scenario, but points that feel dangerous just beyond the newsroom. Elections have always been a great point, whether they're actually going to be dangerous or not. Journalists are more aware, so at that point where they're feeling a little bit more vulnerable, I'm like, oh great, and let me teach you about psychological safety now, like I have you. But also, actually bringing the editors has worked really well for us. They find that that's a space, like editors and journalists and reporters or photographers find that that's a really great space to work. And the last thing, actually, I'm going to echo some of what you were saying, Joel. For us, it's worked. The idiosyncrasies at the New York Times is so big that it's not only about the newsroom. Each desk has its own idiosyncrasies, so I try to tailor a lot of what we do for the way they work and the things that are really important to them, so that it feels like, yes, what you're doing is something that requires or that would be really interesting to engage with us on.
Yeah, and I mean, do you have something to add? I have one brief. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I agree, Maria. It's a great answer. Sources. We are usually more worried about our sources than about ourselves. That's the nature of journalists. I think it's a great point of entrance. About psychological problems, as I told you when I started, this has been maybe the hardest part for us. We don't know exactly how to do it. And the more I think about it, I think it's also a generational thing. For my generation, we were always more reluctant to accept that there were any psychological problems. For the new generations, this is more natural. So they are the ones pushing us to do some things. Everybody at El Faro has access to psychological assistance if needed. We have that for anybody, but for some people that just don't work. If you don't feel comfortable talking to a professional on psychology, well, that will not work. But then there's other ways to attend psychological or emotional problems. One of the most frequent ones, at least in Latin America, are peer-to-peer conversations, and these are very important ways to deal with emotional or psychological problems.
Yeah. I mean, and I would just add to that. I mean, first of all, I think it's so important that New York Times and other major news organizations are modeling this and making it, normalizing it, making it part of their practice. And we have a role, I think, one of the reasons I'm at the Newark School, and I want to recognize Graciela Machowski, the dean who's here with us, is because I think the other entry point is through journalism education. I mean, if we can sort of bring this in as something that's part of your training as a journalist, and the journalists entering the profession have this expectation, that's a way to change the culture in the long term. So that would also be my answer. Lots of questions. I think you have the microphone. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm exile-based journalist, Emin Hussein from Azerbaijan. My question is, first of all, thank you very much for organizing very important side event on these topics. Right now in Azerbaijan we have lots of imprisoned journalists,
Yeah.
and 30 arrested journalists, and half of them arrested because wrong risk assessment by donors who support them. And when we engage as like independent like journalists organizations with them, with donors, we always call them for guys. The model which is you support your grantees, it's not safe. They will definitely arrest it. Nobody will want to listening as, and I have a feeling as like I'm like journalist defender. Nobody seriously care about journalist safety or risk assessment, and sometimes even journalists, when we told to these journalists, for guys, you should think about this twice before accepting this cheap like a grant from the grantees, which is from the donor, which don't care about your safety, which is, and when we try to advise them for guys, you need to add this and this like articles to your budget for keep you more secure. Donors always reject this project. They not really care. They're always looking for cheap solutions. And when exile-based like human rights groups criticize them, they say, for guys, you don't understand. You have a paranoia. We want to go and support our colleagues inside the country. Now they are arrested and nobody even able to support them in prison.
Yeah.
How is it possible to change donors' mind to more thinking about these important topics, risk assessment, especially for public interest media who operated in authoritarian states? Thank you.
Well, that's a terrible story. I'm really sorry to hear about that, and I'm sorry that that's been your experience. And of course, I'm familiar with the climate in Azerbaijan and how repressive it is. You know, I don't have a simple answer to that. I mean, I would just say, you know, clearly, you know, news organizations themselves need to be aware of the risk and this needs to be based, just picking up on the point that Carlos made, on trust between the reporter and the editor. And maybe it's important that the donors be involved in those discussions and also develop an awareness and appreciation of the risk environment and that their funding aligns with that reality. So, I mean, I don't know if anyone wants to add to that, but that's my...
I don't have a particular answer beyond what Joel said, but both at CPJ and ACOS, we have long advocated for financial support from the beginning for freelancers as part of the security assessment. If they should not have to, journalists should not have to put their safety second to being paid. So it's important to continue to talk about the importance of putting the safety line in budgets for projects that are risky as you're thinking about the risk assessment.
Okay, other questions? There's one in the front here.
Hi, I'm Méline Lafabrie. I'm the founder of an organization called IDONI. We're very young, so there's no money, which I think is an important factor for that. And we focus on how conflict and crisis affect people and reshape communities. So we have 30 people based in 20 countries, going from Ecuador, South Sudan, Canada, Pakistan, Denmark. So very different situations, very different contexts. And we're shaping from the beginning, you know, processes to make sure that they're as safe in all the factors that we talked about. But when you have a team that is so diverse, what are the first steps you would say we could start? And of course, you know, based on each stories, we'll do specific risk assessment, taking into account, but things that could work for such a diverse team, because I think we're going towards more and more media organizations that are built like this.
I don't know your organization, but I would think that you don't have in these terms, you don't have a diverse big organization. You have several small organizations in each country, and each country needs to address the risks of each specific environment. I'm sure it's not the same problems that you face when you're reporting in Syria than when you're reporting in Ecuador. So you need a local solution. And by the way, I was just thinking, I can imagine there are some freelancers here thinking, how can I build trust with an editor if I don't have one, right? Well, you need to. That's my answer. In our case, there's a lot of freelancers in El Salvador that we are friends with that would call us when they go to do some work, and we monitor them and we assess them and we work as their bouncing board. The fact that you're a freelancer doesn't mean that you can, you can, but it's not advisable to go on your own on these risky coverages. You need to find someone that you trust to work as your bouncing board or risk advisor in these cases.
I actually think you're at the right starting point. You're thinking about the diversity in the reporting teams and the diversity in situations. So that's a great place to start. At the end, it's not that dissimilar for each. You have to sit and think about what is the story, who's going to report it, and what are the risks. So the structure is there for you. You just, to echo Carlos, you look at the local situation and the team. I will again plug the safety clinics because we're doing them for editors as well and for news managers. So if you want to come over, we can talk to you more about your newsroom.
And I would just make one other comment, which is, journalism is a very competitive field, but not when it comes to safety. And I've, in my experience, found people are very generous. I wish Amy was here from the New Humanitarian, because I think they have undoubtedly dealt with similar challenges, and I'm confident that they would be a good resource to, share from and learn from their experience. So I think we have another question over here.
Hi, yeah, I'm Kieran Murray with Reuters. So much of risk assessment is around specific situations, whether it's the setters chasing you on the border or two reporters going to a sex party. What do you do, especially for you, Carlos, because you mentioned it briefly, what do you do about the long-term threats around mental health and emotional well-being for your reporters, and any broader advice, especially for smaller news organizations, to protect the long-term health of their reporters?
Well, again, we're not very good at that, but we have a very open newsroom where we discuss things very openly. It's a very horizontal organization. El Faro is very horizontal. And we openly discuss about these things. And some people ask for help among the group. They say, we need these kind of things. As I told you, we talk about this frequently, and we have psychologists at their disposal. If someone needs assistance, there is a professional there. If someone needs to talk about specific situations, we are open enough to have this conversation. To give you an example, for the last 5 years, under this new harassment from the government, some people have left El Faro, thinking, I didn't sign in for this. I signed in to make journalism, not to be harassed, not to have people threatening my family, blah, blah, blah. But most of the people that have left are women. So I have meetings with the women of El Faro, trying to understand why, what's different, what's going on, what are their worries. I need to address that. But again, I don't think this is a frequent thing in every organization. I would just recommend everybody to do that, to listen to your people, because it's they that are going through these emotional problems that need to be addressed. And you need people to be in good emotional health to properly do the job. It's very easy. Yeah. I don't know if this is a useful answer for you.
And Maria, I think you've been really a leader also in this particular area. Do you have anything you want to add to close our conversation?
I mean, I think what Carlos said is the best advice. It's the trust and the culture and working to give people the tools they need to do that. At the New York Times, we've worked actually with the Dart Center, and Gavin's here, to roll out a pretty comprehensive support system. What we have done, and I think this is the good in terms of emotional psychological safety, is we have brought it under the umbrella of safety. And we talk about it as safety and as a journalism tool. We don't talk about it as well-being or HR or something additional that you get. It is really about the PPE that you need, the stuff that you need to be able to do your work correctly. And the last thing I'll say again is the importance of giving the tools and the language to everybody who's going to be having that conversation, and making sure that editors like Carlos are on the same page so that the conversation just flows.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much, Carlos, and thanks to all of you for coming. We hope we've empowered you, inspired you. Go to the safety clinics. Thank you again.
Thank you.
That was great. Oh, really? Okay. Oh, well. Yeah. All right, we have to get out of here because the next people come in.
Well, thanks, Joel.
Yeah, that was great. That was great. Very, hope you.